Massive thank you as always to our top tier patrons Sarah Turner and Justin Harper. The podcast takes a considerable amount of work, so we really do appreciate everyone's contribution. You can support us too at patreon.com/it's not just in your head. For as little as $3, you can get access to our Discord community where hosts Ecoy, Hero and myself host weekly live discussions. So come join us. Please do rate us on Apple Podcasts and follow us on social media. We're on Reddit, TikTok, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And if you have any questions or comments about this episode or the podcast in general, then email itsnotjustinyourhead@gmail.com. And this week's random call out goes to patron ML. And just a quick note to say that the recording of this podcast, I had some microphone issues, so I apologize for the slightly lower quality than normal.
In the mental health field, too often, we've made it seem as if it's just in your head.
The landlord can hijack the rent by 20%. That impacts people's mental health.
We can't have a profit-driven mental health care system if we want our people to be connected and healthy.
Is it TESA? Is that how you're supposed to say it?
It's TESA, TESA, TESA Collective. Yeah.
Right, and that stands for something, right?
It does. When we first started 10 years ago, maybe 11 years ago, which is very weird to say, we had this brilliant idea that would be great to have a very long and complicated name. So we're officially the Toolbox for Education and Social Action. And then we were like, that's super long. Let's go ahead and just abbreviate that. So
I came across you guys, I think through Reddit, and because there was I think you posted something in the sort of subreddit about cooperatives, and it was about the game that you just released, Slyke, the Worker Rebellion.
Yeah.
And I not only did I sort of dig in and, order the game and play it and all that sort of stuff, but I did post it on our Reddit and said, would this, what's everyone think? Would this be a good guess? And, there was lots of enthusiastic people about it. So,
thank you.
Yeah. And, I really enjoyed the game. And I think, I don't know if you wanted to sort of say a few words about Slyke.
Yeah, so Slyke is a cooperative board game. It's set in the near future. It's a cooperative game, so everyone's on the same team. Each player takes on the role of a worker with unique skills and in unique industry, from the dock worker to the grocery clerk. And each player represents a worker in the Slyke Council. And the reason there's a Slyke Council is in the game, this evil mega corporation called Happy Corp is trying to take over your city and privatize everything. Get rid of all unions, make everything from sidewalks to whatever privatized. And your goal is to lead a citywide strike to abolish Happy Corp from your city. And we built it with this awesome labor rights organization called Jobs with Justice. They're a very amazing organization. So it's a game by, for, and about the labor movement. I haven't shared it anywhere else. I haven't shared this next tidbit anywhere else. So you guys are getting some exclusive news. So get ready to be a breaking news podcast. But we're working with them to also actually do a follow-up game, sort of like a miniature version of the game that can be like more easily carried around, that works and like played in like settings that we're calling it Slyke Picket Line Edition. So so that'll be coming out, I think, end of this year, start of next. So yeah.
Oh, I will recommend it to Payday Report, which is a report by Mike Elk. That Payday Report, the report by Mike Elk of all the strikes that nobody mentions.
I've heard of that. Absolutely.
Just the idea of using board games. I mean, how did that all sort of come about, or like what was the sort of thinking behind it? Because you obviously make your own games, but you work with a lot of institutions or companies that are also going to approach you. They sort of instinctively maybe realize that games are useful or they can do something. So I'm just sort of wondering what your sort of history was, how you sort of got into doing this to begin with.
Yeah, well, if you don't mind a little bit of a ramble, it all started 15 years ago. No, well, close to that. So I'm one of the co-founders of TESA. Before founding this cooperative, I was teaching at a learning center for teens who had dropped out of school or been kicked out because of drugs or other things. So it was a like a non-compulsory, but place that some of them were homeschoolers as well. Place that people could go, or teenagers could go to still learn and have classes and that kind of stuff. And for a while, I was teaching a class on like music and how to record your own music and all that kind of stuff. And that was super easy to get folks, teens to show up to.
Mm-hmm.
But then I started to, and I was at the time also a college student studying alternative education and that kind of stuff. But when I started to teach a class on U.S. history, controversies in history and people's history, like no one was showing up. And I was like, well, okay. So what can I do to get people to show up? And I was like, all right. So I started to make some board games for the class because again, it wasn't compulsory. People could teens could just show up because this was not a school. And by making the board games, they started showing up, and I realized, okay, this is effective. Like, this is a really cool way to get, to engage and to use alternative forms of outreach and education and that kind of stuff. Fast forward many years later, we founded TESA. And at the time when we started, the idea was not necessarily that we were going to publish board games. We started as a consultancy for nonprofits, cooperatives, community organizations, that kind of stuff, to help them build educational tools, programs for their cause. And we decided to make, just because we're all nerds and gamers, we decided to make a game for one of our projects we were doing. Which it was when we said, hey, let's publish this. And that was our first game called Co-opoly, the Game of Cooperatives. And it ended up being a really, for us, and not, sorry, once.
All right.
Sounds like we went into his digestive tract by mistake.
No problem. Sorry. Yeah, because of the formula shortage, where my wife has that, and she's just giving them away to people. So there were people just coming up, and so there's people just coming in to our house and getting. So I just put up a sign that said, "Hey, here, just go to our backyard and get it." So, anyways, so that shouldn't happen again. Sorry about that.
It's okay.
All right.
Well, it's awfully generous of you, though.
No, well, mutual aid. That's what we got to do, right?
Yep. Agreed.
I was saying Co-opoly was our first game. It was sort of an unexpected hit for us. For us, at least, again, we were a consultancy. We put out this game, and a year or so later, we took it to this little protest that was happening. Someone messaged us online like, hey, we've got this protest. It'd be great if you brought Co-opoly and, da-da-da. We're like, okay, cool. We'll come check it out. And it was this little thing called Occupy Wall Street. And we brought Co-opoly to it. And while we were there, we were like, someone suggested to us, like, hey, you should make a game about like building movements, and we're like, that's a really cool idea. And we started to do it, and then it sort of like fell on the wayside. And then a couple of years later, we were like, you know what? No, we do want to do this. So we made our second game called Rise Up, which is a game about movement building and people power. That also ended up being surprisingly a hit for us. And after that, we sort of were like, you know what? We are a board game publisher now. That's something we do because we're cooperative and we can just make decisions like that. And so in addition to the consultancy work that we continue to do this day, We publish board games. One of our most popular board games is called Cats Fight Fascism, and it's exactly what it sounds like. We've also got Strike. We've got a game upcoming called Community Garden, another game coming up called Sustainable Cities, and on and on. So yeah, like you said, we do also work with organizations to build games for their causes. So we work with the Nature Conservancy, for example, to build a game about water access. We worked with Planned Parenthood to build. We built them an online game for some of their volunteers. So on and so forth. But that was a little bit like the accidental genesis of why we started doing games was this. We saw it as a tool for popular education, but then it also became like a cultural, a way to like reach people culturally, not just through like, hey, people want to learn and engage in stuff, but not just like by reading or watching YouTube videos or getting PowerPoint. They want to experience and feel what it's like to be a part of the thing. So anyways, right. I said this was a ramble and I'll stop there.
Yeah, no, it's a really good point. It's the sort of embodied feeling thing. It's like when you play a game, you sort of do take on a role, and then in taking on that role, you have certain sort of incentives, and that generates certain kinds of feelings. And it's, the co-op idea to begin with of, you are playing against the game, you're not sort of playing against each other. Obviously that's been around for a while, but that does do something to begin with. It sort of changes your relationship with objectives, I guess. And then in particular in Strike, Worker Rebellion, you are you're all working together and you are pushing against this thing. And, it reminded me a bit of Pandemic, the board game as well, just in terms of, and it's just great. It's just great fun. But I think that's fascinating, that insight that your early experiences, like if you do music, the teenagers show up. If you do a history lesson, they don't. And I think this is a big thing. And this is something that is talked about, is the idea of, is talked about online, at least I've seen it a few places. This idea of, can the left sort of do enjoyment? Like there's this thing about like fun and enjoyment seem like complete opposite to politics, right? Politics is serious. You don't mess around, and fun and enjoyment is not. And it seems to me like it's a very sort of persuasive medium. But I don't know if you've seen that.
So, yeah. We sometimes get like people who like, comment on our social media stuff, or, like, oh, why, don't play a game about, activism. You should actually go be doing it. And like, and it's like, hey, guess what? People also like need to enjoy themselves, and also like we need to flex our imagination muscle, and we need to like, not everything is like, when you just say, hey, go organize, like, what does that mean? It doesn't like even mean anything. Like that, it's just like, okay, what do you organize? Go enjoy yourself, build community, like see yourself as agents in the, in the issue you want to be involved in. Like, there was this, I have no idea who said it, and so I like can't contribute it or attribute it correctly, but it stuck with me. Someone said that like, whoever controls our imagination controls our future, and that has sort of like become my guiding light towards what I do in this with board games. I head up our board games at TESA, so it's sort of like we don't have to like there's a time and place to be serious, but like being serious all the time is like what is it? The Emma Goldman quote, if I can't dance, I don't want to be a part of your revolution. Well, if I can't play board games, I don't want to be part of your revolution. So,
right, anyways, exactly. If fun isn't part of the future, like what we were doing here, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Exactly.
It's also, I think, the opposite of a lot of leftism is just they're screwing you, you're a sucker, they used you, they exploited you. That's not exactly an ego builder.
Right.
And so it's not necessarily empowering.
Right.
But to be in these roles is empowering. And I think it's really exciting and needed.
Right.
It's a different part of the culture to build a different idea and sensibility.
Totally.
We need it.
Yeah, and also, I guess there's a structural element to all of this, which is that you are a worker co-op, right? So it's not saying one thing then doing another. There's an element of what was the sort of decision to sort of initially set up in that manner?
Yeah, well, it's funny. We always the intention was always to be a cooperative. I started the company on my own. Just I was like, hey, this is something I want to do, and it's maybe not that. The more I've learned about cooperatives, the more, because we've done a lot of cooperative education. Maybe it was not the right initial path, but it's the one I took. I started the company, and I was just like, I want to do this, and I'll get people to join me as I go. We were doing a lot of work with cooperatives and cooperative education. I interned at the Cooperative Development Institute during college, so I was very in that world. So when I founded TESA, and then the second person came on, it was always intentional that we would build out and bring more people on. So we didn't, technically didn't start as a cooperative, but then it was our goal to become one, and then we did. Our viewpoint was like we don't want anyone to be our boss, but we also don't want to be the boss of anyone. So the way that we do that is that we're all collectively the bosses, but we're all also collectively the workers. I'm not gonna say it's been puppy dogs and rainbows. We have learned tough lessons. We've made mistakes. We've experienced the tyranny of structurelessness at times, and we've had to build out our structure. And as we've defined our roles better, and we've all that kind of stuff, we've gotten much better as a cooperative. But it was always a goal of ours to be involved with building the cooperative movement. And so we're like, hey, we are going to be a cooperative itself. That has had challenges because, we started out now as just an education consultancy for nonprofits, and education in this country is not valued, and so people have a hard time wanting to pay for that when they and I think that's one of the reasons we also expanded into board games was hey, we can sell things and make money through this avenue as well. But the point being that when we started, we sort of were a bit structureless, and just sort of oh, we'll all sort of do whatever, and we're all involved. And then as time went on, we're like, you know what? No, the best way to sort of act as a cooperative is to have clearly delineated roles, and to have open lines of communication, but to be able to be autonomous, but to be able to trust each other to do our thing. Hey, you're in charge of this thing, I'm in charge of this thing, I'll report back. If we have certain decisions we have to make together, great. But, we don't have to all work on the newsletter together. That can be one person's job, just as a sort of micro example. So, so it was always our intention, but like I said, I don't want to put it on a pedestal and say it was always great and easy. When you're running a cooperative, you're running a business and a democracy within a economic landscape that on both fronts doesn't want you to succeed. So yeah.
Right, yeah. A business and a democracy is a really good way of putting it, I think, because it is sort of fascinating. I know I remember reading some David Graeber stuff, and he was talking about this is just what it is. Humans are messy, and it's just difficult, and a lot of the structures that are sort of created are there to sort of to some degree, I guess in a sort of corporate structure, they're there just to shave off the edges of being a human, and that has a cost. But that it gets things done in air quotes. But to what end? If everyone's sort of drugged up just to get to work on time and all that sort of stuff, right. It becomes a problem. But I think that's really interesting. The idea that which is sort of foundational to co-ops, right? Which is that no one's going to be anyone else's boss, but we're all going to collectively be each other's. We're all going to be held accountable in some respect. I can imagine that is just a process of like trying to figure it out. Like maybe there is no blueprint because every sort of person is different. I assume there must have been was there material that you followed to help you structure your co-op, or were you just sort of stumbling around in the dark, like just learning how to sort of work with each other?
I should absolutely say there absolutely are blueprints. When, like I said, we started our cooperative 11 years ago, we did it very, like I said, very sloppily, but there are cooperatives of different shapes and sizes and structures. So you do have very collectivized horizontal cooperative, and we should I put my nerd hat on for a second. We should delineate there are different types of cooperatives, right? There are worker-owned cooperatives, and so the people who run and own and manage those are workers. There are also consumer cooperatives, which are often grocery stores, but not exclusively. There are artists and producer cooperatives. There are just like farming cooperatives. So there's a cooperative is just a structure, but there's a movement behind certain sections of cooperatives, mostly such like worker cooperatives and certain sides of consumer cooperatives. But even in the worker cooperative world, there are worker cooperatives that are 3 people, and there are worker cooperatives that are 100 people. There are worker cooperatives that are collectives, and then there are worker cooperatives that do elect a board of directors, a president, But again, what's important in that context is that those board of directors, that president, they are directly accountable to the workers. They get their power and their authority to take action from the workers, and the workers can vote them in, vote them out, and so on and so forth. There at this time there is a very robust cooperative movement, and the United States, as per usual, is playing catch up with the rest of the world, but there are amazing worker cooperative and cooperative in general, like support and development organizations that can anywhere from how to start a cooperative. We've worked with a bunch of worker co-op training academies. We helped put together like a co-op, like a short free documentary on how to start a co-op that you can watch online. It's called Own the Change. But there are, there's the U.S. Federation of Worker Cooperatives. There's the Democracy at Work Institute. There's Democracy at Work Network. I think you mentioned one of those earlier. There are cooperative, and there's how-to guides. There are cooperative trainers and developers who you can work with. If you want to find one near you, there's a website called Cooperation Works, and you type in where you are, and it'll show you the closest cooperative developer that can work with you. So at this point, like and there's cooperative loan funds that like specifically give loans, non-predatory loans to cooperatives and people who are trying to start cooperatives and that kind of stuff. So at this point, the cooperative movement in the U.S. has done a really good job of building up this ecosystem of support, and has built these blueprints. I think some of that was there 10 years ago when we started, but it has become much more robust now. And if you want to start a cooperative, or even one big thing that the cooperative movement is advocating for is actually transitioning existing businesses to cooperatives. So if an owner is looking to sell their business or just whatever, there is a big ecosystem and network of support to be able to make that happen.
Since the podcast it's not just in your head, I was wondering how you would explain the psychological interpersonal effects of creating a cooperative organization based on instilling cooperative values in relationship with each other. Because, a capitalist relationship is one thing where you exist to provide wealth for someone else, and a cooperative is different, and your cooperative is an example. And I wonder if you would talk a little bit about the effect on personal life and values of creating a cooperative movement through both your co-op organization, but also the games you produce.
Yeah, totally. I mean, it's just like it's a different way to look at yourself, your relationship to work, your relationship to your community, the relationship to what you do. When I've worked in both cooperatives and not cooperatives, and in cooperatives, there's dumb stuff you have to do. There's there's stuff you have to do that this is so pointless. Oh God! But it's like, oh yeah, it's for the business that I collectively own and run. Okay, great. I understand. I got to do this for rather than I'm doing this to line the pockets of yada 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 person. So there is like a mental shift. There's there is a feeling of solidarity and mutual aid, but as was said earlier, we are people. So, and again, I don't want to paint it as puppy dogs and rainbows. There's systems are made out of people. They're not made out of bricks, and that extends to cooperatives. And you can have conflicts in cooperatives. Cooperatives are falling apart because of interpersonal conflicts. Like I said, it is a democracy, and it's not in democracy, like any democracy, it can be affected by bad faith actions and that kind of stuff. But it is, at the end of the day, what a cooperative does, working as in a cooperative movement, is you're repositioning capital so that it is subordinate to labor, and not so that labor is subordinate to capital. And the reason that capital is being produced is to benefit the workers, to benefit the welfare of the community that you're a part of. And that's why, like I said earlier, we were able to just be like, hey, we just do board games now, right? Because that we want, and we're like, yeah, let's do that. In a normal business, that would not be so easy. But to give a more concrete example, during the pandemic, I know I wrote an article early on in the pandemic, when we were in month 2 or something like that. I don't know. But about how cooperatives were shifting their business model. Some cooperatives were shifting their business model because, they were working on house renovation. They were, house renovation cooperatives or something like that. And that wasn't happening, right? That they suddenly freeze on that, but rather than laying laying all the staff off and they said, okay, hey, what do we do now? We gotta, the point is, in a cooperative, you share the benefits in a good time and you share the burdens in hard times, right? So in this hard time, they were like, we're not going to lay ourselves off. What are we going to do? Okay, now we are a food delivery service. Now we are a da-da-da-da-da. And they just shifted rapidly during the pandemic, when suddenly their entire structure or purpose was taken out from under them. And it was this collective call to action, because they had to share that burden during the hard time, rather than just one person at the top saying, well, I got to lay off my workforce and wait till this rolls over. So that there's that sort of sense of solidarity and mutual aid. But again, we are people. We can make mistakes. Some cooperatives I know did try to shift during the pandemic, and it didn't work out, and they didn't make it. But it's this ability to think. I'll give a much more personalized example. One of my colleagues last year was in a terrible accident and had a terrible head trauma and concussion, and just wasn't able to work for 4 months. And we said, okay, we got you. You have nothing to worry about in terms of your job. We got you. We're pulling together, and we're gonna get you covered. And he thankfully recovered and was able to come back. But like, in a normal business, that person would really be worried about their job, right? So I'll stop rambling there, but hopefully that addresses your question.
I had another question. Is if someone in the co-op is not really pulling their weight, how do you handle that?
That's on a co-op by co-op basis. It's that really, it really depends. But you can just say, hey, you're not pulling your weight. What's going on? But sometimes that doesn't solve things. Cooperatives, they can't, usually in that there's several things that depend, right? Is this a large cooperative with a more vertical structure? Is this a smaller cooperative with a more horizontal structure? It depends, but usually, you have things like bylaws. Not usually, you do as a cooperative have bylaws and governance structures in place so that you can address something like this. Is it a small thing of, hey, someone just like is having a tough week and just like kind of checked out? Okay, talk to them. Or is this like someone who's just like really just like riding the wave and not helping out and at all? And we've gone through this before, not to any sort of level of extreme, but talk to someone like, hey, what's going on? Like, feel like you're and sometimes like you put things in place. There's always like, there seems to be a gotcha question that there's like, well, how do you fire someone in a cooperative? And it's like, well, okay, usually you try not, like, the main goal is to not get to that point. But because usually in a cooperative, what happens is when you bring someone on, if you're already established, you have something called like an incubation, or sometimes it's called a probationary period. But I prefer incubation, where they are, different cooperatives have different timelines for it. Some have a set number of hours, some have like 6 months, 9 months, a year. But you are a worker, you're not an owner for that amount of time. And after that amount of time, if it looks like you're a good fit, then the cooperative votes to welcome you in as a full member. And that's at first, sometimes people hear that and they're like, well, that's not fair. Well, it is fair, because you got to make sure that this person, want to have this person be an owner in your company. Right. So usually in a process where if you get to a point where you have to like get rid of someone, like, you've exhausted your efforts, or it's clear it's not working out, or some co-ops have split. Some have, very rarely here, in a consensus-based cooperative, there is this something called consensus -1. And if it's like, hey, everyone, there's a cooperative of 16 people and 15 people agree that this one person is just not they can consensus -1 vote that person out, and that kind of stuff. So it depends and but usually the goal is not to get to that place. Usually the goal is like, hey, how do we like address what's going on? But the most important part for that is like making sure that this is someone you want to be a member of your cooperative before you even invite them in.
Mm-hmm.
That makes sense.
Yeah. I was also impressed when I was looking through the website as well, like the just how the actual board games are made, sort of generally USA made and sustainable, and that you're working with other worker co-ops as well, right? Like, I think the video was about a worker co-op which did exactly the thing that you were talking about, which is like when the pandemic hit, not lay anyone off, just take a pay cut to survive. So yeah, I don't know if you wanted to talk a bit about the sort of actual process of making the games and sort of that decision.
Sure. Do you mean like how we manufacture them, or
and the sustainability and all that sort of stuff?
Yeah. So like, I mean, it's important for us to walk the walk. I mean, to walk the talk.
Walk the walk is good. Yeah, I think it's right.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, our games are about changing the world, and it would be super easy for us to go and have our games made and traditional way and and say great and thanks, here you go. But that's not something we want to do. I don't, when I say this, sometimes people assume I'm like bashing people who like make games traditionally, and I'm not, because look, I will tell you from experience, making games ethically and sustainably is very hard and has taken up a lot of my time. So we exist within a system that does not make that easy.
Yes.
So I get it. And I have no, unless you're if you are purposefully seeking someone to do a production route that is purposefully exploitative and cruel, then okay, that's different. But if you're just following the normal paths out there, then I got nothing but against you. But we do see it as our goal to try to help build the ability for people to make games more ethically and more sustainably. Oftentimes that has meant domestic, but it's not exclusive. I don't view that through a nationalistic lens. Sometimes when people are made in the USA, it's that's a nationalistic thing. And to me, that's not that. It's mostly about okay, being able to know the labor practices and the da-da-da and cutting down the carbon footprint of who we're working with. But sometimes it's not possible. So, right now we're going to work with a Polish firm that we've checked them out and gone through. They've got great labor practices. Their sustainability practices are amazing. But so we work with a number of producers. We've worked with U.S. worker-owned cooperative print shops. We've worked with unionized print shops in the U.S. And that kind of stuff. And one of the things we're trying, one of the things that's challenging is every game we put out is a little different. It's got a little different shape. It's got different size, whatever. It's got different components. So not everyone can do the same thing. So what we have done though is we've worked with some of these publishers to build up their capacity, and then we talk about them, we promote them, we refer people to them, and I know several of them now who did not print board games before we started working with them. We're now advertised on their website. Hey, we can print board games, and they're a U.S. worker-owned cooperative, and all that kind of stuff. So we view our goal as to we're making our games, but also while we're making our games, we're trying to make a path for other people can try to follow in terms of making games ethically and sustainably. But within that context, it's sort of when I say ethically and sustainably, that's not black and white. There's always going to be again, there truly is no ethical consumption under capitalism. We can do the best we can, but somewhere along the path, something, oil companies are getting paid to ship, the game to your door. I'm making this game on a computer that sourced from data, so nothing's going to be perfect, but we can try to do the best we can within the bounds of also not putting ourselves out of business, but also within the bounds of hey, our goal is to make it so what we're doing here can make it more possible for other people to follow this path. And we have been seeing that, which is actually really cool and really exciting, that we know a number of print shops now are hey, yeah, we're working with these people because you work with us to build out this capacity and that kind of stuff. So but I do have to say it is harder to make the games this way, and it costs a little bit more than just the traditional paths that are set up. So it requires a bit of commitment, but all change in the world does. So so that's sort of our view on our production is we're not just trying to produce stuff for ourselves, we're trying to produce stuff to make a path for other people.
Yeah, and I thought the the bit on your website where you're sort of recommending these different printers and the experiences you've had with them, it's that's exactly the sort of open sharing transparency thing that stuff can be like.
Right.
You're not like, it's not like some sort of cold-blooded rivalry between you and other board game makers. It's like, hey, here's our experience. We'll share it with you.
Exactly.
Which I think is great. Sorry, I realized, Harriet, did you, or Ikoi, did you have other questions?
Well, I was just, I don't, one of the I know like this is board games and not video games.
There are some games online. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Okay. And, I was just wondering if since I'm really not much of a gamer, so this is kind of like a area that is completely outside of my expertise. But, do you think that there is a difference in terms of impact between the two and what they are?
Between board games and video games?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, okay, I'm going to say yes, definitely, and then also I'm going to say no. Both things are true simultaneously. But for me, and since I love board games and I love video games, a board game is a very is by its nature is a very social medium.
Yeah.
Right.
And video games can be that way too. So I don't want to knock them, but they're not by nature bad. But board games are, hey, if there's any people who are deep in the board game world right now, I can hear someone saying, well, what about solo board games? Okay, fine. But just put that to the side for a second. But, most board games are, you're playing with other people, and it is a social experience. And it's something where you're often, not always, there's games like Yahtzee and stuff, but more and more, definitely now, like the idea of theme is very important in board games. So I'm just staring at my board game shelf right now, and I see board game about, hiking the national parks. I see a board game about saving endangered species. I see a board game about feeding a zombie apocalypse. I see a board game about, brewing magic potions. And so I feel in a board game, more and more these days, you are telling, even if not intentionally, you're telling a narrative when you're playing a game collectively. And there's some games that are just pure mechanics and don't have theme, and fine. But when you're playing a board game, you're talking, even if it's a competitive game, you're engaging with your other players and that kind of stuff. And so, one, do you all know about the secret true history of Monopoly?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, cool. All right. Well, I don't need to go into it then, but there is a long history, including Monopoly, which was originally the landlord's game, but there's other board games historically. There's a game called Suffragetto, which is a game about suffragettes fighting the police for their right to vote. There is a game from the 1970s called Class Struggle. So this is not like a purely new thing, but I think it is a growing thing where board games are about doing something with other people. Video games can do that as well. Video games are obviously very much narrative. Many of them are very narrative focused, but you're really sitting in front of a screen, which I like to do. So that's not a knock, but it is a difference in that you have this sense of being together, and yeah. So I will. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I mean, I've always liked the tactile. Yeah, and again, I haven't, played video games since the original Quake days, which really.
Oh yeah.
So that was the last time that I played video games, and a lot has changed since then. Yeah. So the newer ones actually give me a lot of motion sickness, so I can't.
Yeah, fair enough.
But I've always felt like the tactile, the pieces, especially with Monopoly. Yeah. And being able to hold them in my hand, and I would get really attached to them. And right. I just remember board games having a very different impact. on me as a child, especially as a kid.
Yeah.
And so I was just wondering if those were some of, the intentions of going into board games. And also, like,
Yeah.
crafting those pieces seems like it would be like a fun part of the process.
It is fun. Because I'm so in the weeds, I now like think very strongly about, okay, well, if we do a piece that's this big, that's going to increase this cost, that's going to increase this shipping. So I've lost a little bit of the fun with the Forest for the Trees but it is really fun. Like, and it's really creative that, like, anyone can, like, get even if you're not like selling it for the world, like, you're just making it for yourself and your friends, anyone can make a board game. Get some paper, get some pen, you can make a board game. It's something that really is an accessible thing, accessible thing that, like, truly any person who wants to sit down and do it can do it. I'm not gonna say anyone can make a good board game, but I can say anyone can make a board game that can be good for the purpose of what they're making it for. Which I think is a very, very cool thing. And which is why I think there's also, I think we were one of the original people making radical board games, at least in this current era. And I'm sorry, and in terms of making radical board games. But we're not the only ones now. And it's super cool. And it's super cool when I see a game and I'm like, God, I wish we had made that game. Like, that's cool that other people are doing that. I'm so, like, yes, there's part of me like, oh man, I wish we did that. But then I'm also like, I got to get that game and I got to play it and I got to support these people. I think the barrier to entry is much lower than something like a video game. So, which is I think, yeah.
I wonder though, since video games, by and large, are extremely violent as well as individual, and since they're in a male gender sphere, and all the mass murderers have been male and kind of denied the vulnerabilities of their own suffering and longing and loneliness. I wonder if you have any games that kind of counteract the gender limitations on the male role that I think participate in the solution to robbed manhood and robbed power by shooting people. So I wondered if you address those in your games, video or otherwise.
Yeah, well, we don't really make video games. We have a couple of online games, but those are more like training tools for nonprofits that we've developed. So I can't really speak to the development of video games. But I do want to say, like, one thing that I think I want to challenge a little bit is that I think, there's actually been a lot of studies that have come out recently that show that, like, women make up, at least, if not more, like 50% of video game players.
Oh, good.
And this is like a, it's a assumption that it's mostly men playing it, but women make up a huge percentage of video game players. Yeah,
and games.
Yeah, and now there are, of course, there are terrible, violent video games and what role video games play and stuff, I don't know. But I do. What I will say is that, like, there are, just like I'm looking at a board game on my shelf right now about bird watching, which is very fun and one of the most popular board games out there. There are video games out there that are not about they're not
people or anything.
Yeah, or it's just not like killing. About war. I guess I'll say. There's a game you can play that's about where you're a duck going around town and annoying, a goose going around town and annoying people. There are so many video games out there that are about different things and are about I think the most popular ones are these huge whatever. Modern warfare, yada yada yada, which are effectively, training or recruitment tools for the army. But there are video games in themselves, I do not think are a violent medium. But there are, just like, I'd say the same about books and movies, and there are video games out there that are about really inspiring things, and some not. Some are not about inspiring things, but are just good video games. So yeah. One example I'll give actually is, it's funny. Sonic the Hedgehog was originally created in the 1990s as a critique of environmental destruction, and the creator of it said at the time, like, that was a real hush hush thing, because that was during the 90s, that was pretty taboo, but he incorporated that more and more in other as the games went on. So there is this sort of like history of video games as a tool for promoting change, just like the original Monopoly and that kind of stuff. But yeah, anyways, I have a little bit of a complicated relationship to violence in video games, because I'll play some violent video games occasionally, but that's not my main cup of tea. But I don't know that. Anyways, I'll stop there.
I think there's a parallel between Monopoly and Call of Duty, which is just that the culture has ideals, and Monopoly allowed you to be the ultra capitalist, the winner, and collectively we live in a sort of militaristic culture, and it has ideas about what it is to be a man. And so Call of Duty allows you to go around shooting people, dominating and winning. You get to be the hero, the winner. And I think that there's something interesting in this sort of radical publishing, whether it's video games or board games versus the mainstream, which is can you, I think the interest, one of the interesting challenges is, can you make a game that appeals to that sort of perverse mainstream? And I mean Monopoly. Oh yeah, I get to be the dirty capitalist, but it doesn't have that effect by the end of the game. By the end of I actually think Monopoly, by the end of most games, people are like, oh, screw this, right? But I don't think that they're like, screw capitalism at the end of the game. But I just wonder, can you make video games? Can you make board games that have that appeal to the sort of the more illicit, darker stuff, but then you come out the other end feeling something different,
Yeah, and that empower without violence, because the young men that I've worked with as a therapist, the ones who are particularly disturbed, usually are totally into violent board game, not violent video games, where the winner is the person who knocks down and destroys. So I wondered, it's really adjacent to Liam's question, are there board games that seem to be inviting destruction, but actually teach that it wasn't a great idea?
I get asked this question sometimes, can we make a game where it's you're supposed to do this, but then you learn subtly that this was the thing. And I'm gonna be honest, that's not the strong suit of a board game. A board game is not a medium that is great for subtlety. I like to say that board games are good for embodying things or experiencing things or seeing yourself as an agent in things. I'm sure there's some games out there that are that might prove me wrong on this specific thing, but in most cases, a board game is, hey, you want to save the planet, let's do that. Or, hey, you can choose to destroy the planet or save the planet. And, you can see the outcomes. But a board game is not a good, teaching tool in the sense of it, I've now learned this. A board game is a better, medium for experiencing, engaging. But when someone tries to ask me to, make a board game that, I've had teach Republicans that, and this is a very simplistic, whatever. But like teach Republicans that, like, get Republicans to play it, and then they learn by the end of it that racism is bad. Like, I can't do that. That's not.
No.
A, I don't know that I can do that in general, but B, like, I don't know that, like, a board game is not going to do that for you. So now video games might be a place where there could be some more room for nuance. One example I'll give, and this doesn't tick the box of not being violent, but everything else. It's a game called This War of Mine, and they actually did make a board game adaptation of it, which I haven't played, but I have played the video game. And the point of This War of Mine is that you are playing as civilians that are trying to survive a war, and it is an absolutely heartbreaking, heart-wrenching experience. And you're not playing as you make hard decisions, but it tries to show the horrors of war through the perspective of people surviving in a war. And I think it does a brilliant job. But again, it's very dark, and it is very violent, and it's but it's a very good game. Don't play it if you're depressed, which was a mistake I made at the time. But it left a very strong impact. And so that is a place where I think video games can take on the subtlety of things a bit more than a board game, which is a very straightforward but engaging medium.
Yeah, and I think you make a key point that like half of these gamers are women, and they're not shooting they're not shooting up schools and stuff. So it's not the video games, is it? It's something else. It's not violence. It's clearly much more complicated or bigger than that.
I'm not the person to make you all are much closer to that, being able to make that, figure out what's going on there than I am. But yes, I mean, I don't know that I subscribe to the idea that violent video games make people go do violent things, but I do think it is. Oh, there's a hummingbird right outside my window. Sorry. I do think that it is. It is true that violent video games are part of a larger package of a culture that promotes and idealizes violence, and that can help move certain people along certain paths. But I think there are other things moving them along that path, including white nationalism and yada. So
male supremacy, but we wouldn't think that any one aspect of a society produces one behavior. It's just, I was wondering if there were video games that counteracted some of this idealization of male violence.
Oh yeah, there certainly are, and I'm just like going to have a total brain blank right now of what they are, but
no, I'm glad they exist.
Yeah.
And I think boys who are disempowered are attracted to male empowerment, which can be easily accessed by violent video games.
Right. And look, there are also bad, and there are board games that promote, colonialism and slavery and that kind of stuff. So I'm not going to say board games are outside of that
purity.
World.
No.
Their art and their reflection of cultural moments and people's beliefs and that kind of stuff. There's a huge argument in the board game world and industry and about games that feature that sort of stuff. I
guess of course it's a medium that is there for people to use to whatever purpose they want. Okay,
awesome.
Well, thank you.
Thank you so much. I know I didn't have much to contribute, but just again, this is not a field that I know a lot about, and it was really a pleasure listening to you talk about it.
Holy shit!
Yeah,
we
same with me.
need some. Not that we've got the capital to pay for it, but we, suddenly thinking, oh yeah, like a mental health board game would be kind of interesting. Like, what angle would you take on it, and what would the adventure be?
That's a very cool idea.
It certainly is.
Meet Freud idea. Somewhere in the toilet or something.
Right.
There you go. That's the Freud in the toilet. You got your title.
Massive thank you as always to our VIP patrons, Rebecca Johns, Sheena Bilmus, Alexander Lashley, Jennifer Cox, Seamus O'Connell, Alex Placito, and Bruce Rogers Vaughan.
If you have enjoyed anything you've heard Harriet say in this program, you will definitely enjoy Capitalism Hits Home, which is a solo program that Harriet does through Democracy at Work, which is a worker-owned cooperative that produces other great programs such as Economic Update with Richard Wolff and the Anti-Capitalist Chronicles with David Harvey. I can't recommend enough that everyone also listen to Capitalism Hits Home if you enjoy It's Not Just in Your Head.
And you can hear more from Harriet on her radio show called Interpersonal Update. It's on WBAI at 2:30 EST on Wednesday afternoons and in the WBAI archives.